The handcuffs bit into her wrists before she even had time to speak. Sergeant Derek Holloway's grip was iron, and he wasn't being gentle about it. He never was with people he thought didn't matter. He dragged Maya Whitaker through the open floor of the Riverside Police Department precinct on a Tuesday morning while 30 officers watched and said nothing. Some looked away. Some almost smiled. A 23-year-old black woman in a rookie's uniform, stumbling forward with her hands locked behind her back, being walked through her own workplace like livestock. Nobody moved. Nobody asked a single question. They all assumed they already knew the answer. They were wrong about every single thing. If this story already has you gripped, stay with me until the very end because what happens next will shake you. Hit like, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The drive from Columbus had taken Maya Whitaker 3 hours on a gray March morning, and she spent most of it not thinking about the case. She thought about her mother's kitchen, the particular smell of cornbread and burnt coffee, the way the radio in there always played slightly too loud, how her mother used to say, "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, baby," in that voice that meant the exact opposite. She thought about her mentor at the academy, a dry, sharp woman named Agent Lois Pemberton, who had told her on the last day of training, without ceremony, "Don't get comfortable. The moment you feel comfortable, you've already made your first mistake." Maya had not been comfortable in a long time. She pulled off the highway at exit 14 and followed the directions she had memorized rather than typed into any phone. The town of Millhaven, Ohio, sat at the eastern edge of a county that had been economically declining for 15 years. Shuttered factories, a downtown with too many empty storefronts, a high school that had lost its sports teams one by one as the tax base evaporated. What Millhaven had not lost was its police department. The Millhaven Police Department was well-funded, well-armed, and largely unaccountable, which is exactly the combination that tends to produce the kind of institutional rot that takes years to build and ruins lives in minutes. She parked the beat-up Civic she'd been assigned, civilian vehicle, nothing traceable, 2 blocks from the precinct, and sat for a moment with the engine off. In the glove box was a badge, a real one, that she wasn't allowed to use. In her left shoe, along the inner sole, was a data card. In her memory were 14 months of preliminary investigation files, the faces of 4 officers under federal scrutiny, and the name of a sergeant who had collected 18 commendations and managed to walk away clean from 6 separate internal affairs complaints. She was not a rookie. She had never been a rookie. But for the next several weeks or months, however long this took, she was going to be the most convincing one the Millhaven PD had ever seen. Maya Whitaker stepped out of the car, smoothed down the front of her uniform, took a breath of cold Ohio air, and walked toward the precinct looking like someone who wasn't sure she belonged there, which was, of course, exactly the point. The desk sergeant who processed her arrival was a pale, compact man named Officer Ruiz who looked like he'd eaten bad news for breakfast every day for 12 years. He handed her a locker assignment, a duty roster, and a laminated card with the department's code of conduct printed on it in font so small it was essentially unreadable. "You're assigned to Sergeant Holloway's unit," he said, without looking up from his paperwork. "He likes his people on time and quiet. You late on your first day?" "No, sir." "Then you're already doing better than the last 2. He finally glanced at her. His expression didn't change. "You'll learn the ropes fast or you won't last. Nobody has time to babysit." "Understood." "Locker room's down the hall. Holloway does briefing at 7 sharp. She found the locker room, changed into the patrol jacket she'd been issued, and stood at the mirror for a few seconds longer than she needed to. The woman looking back at her looked tired. She'd worked hard to achieve that. 2 weeks of poor sleep before her arrival, a slightly disheveled bun, the barely there confidence of someone who had passed the academy but wasn't sure what came next. It was a costume as precisely constructed as anything in theater. Every detail chosen, the slight hesitation in her walk, the way she'd hold her notepad like she was still memorizing how to use it. She had studied behavioral psychology for 8 months before this assignment. She knew exactly how people read other people, how quickly they make decisions about competence, about threat level, about whether someone is worth taking seriously. She needed Sergeant Holloway and his unit to decide, within the first 10 minutes, that she was worth approximately nothing. From everything in his file, that wouldn't be difficult to arrange. Derek Holloway was not a large man, which surprised people sometimes. He was average height, average build, with thinning reddish hair and a jaw that sat slightly forward, like he was perpetually ready to argue. He'd been on the force for 22 years and spent most of that time cultivating a reputation that was equal parts legend and threat. 18 commendations. A feature in the county newspaper 3 years ago. Millhaven's finest, the officer who never backs down. A photograph on the precinct wall, which Maya had already clocked when she walked in, showing Holloway shaking hands with the mayor at a community event. He was also, according to 14 months of federal surveillance and whistleblower testimony, the architect of a systematic pattern of evidence fabrication, civilian targeting, and internal intimidation that had sent at least 6 innocent people to prison and silenced an unknown number of officers who'd tried to report him. He walked into the briefing room at 6:58 and stopped when he saw Maya sitting in the second row. She watched him process her the way she'd expected. A quick scan, a slight pause, the tiniest shift in expression that wasn't quite contempt, but was the blueprint of it. She looked down at her notepad, didn't make eye contact, let him draw his conclusions. "New face," he said, not to her specifically. "Whitaker?" "Yes, sir." She stood slightly too fast, like she was nervous. He looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he moved on to the briefing without acknowledging her further. She wrote the word "good" in the margin of her notepad and underlined it twice. The briefing was standard patrol assignments, traffic enforcement priorities, a notice about road construction on Elmfield Avenue that would affect response times. But Maya was listening for something different, listening to how Holloway spoke, how the room responded to him, which officers leaned in and which ones kept their faces carefully neutral. There was a lieutenant in the corner named Marcus Vale, younger than Holloway, but deferential in a specific way that spoke less of respect and more of arrangement. 2 patrol officers, Stroud and Falco, who laughed a beat after Holloway laughed, who occupied the comfortable zone of men who've learned that alignment with power is safer than integrity. And then there were 2 other officers, a woman named Torres, and a heavy-set man named Greer, who didn't laugh and didn't lean in, who watched Holloway with the particular stillness of people managing something they can't afford to say out loud. Maya filed all of it away. "Whitaker," Holloway said at the end, "you're riding with me today." The patrol car smelled like stale coffee and something chemical she couldn't identify. Holloway drove the way he ran briefings, with a kind of absolute certainty about his ownership of the space. The radio turned low, his hand resting on the steering wheel with the casual authority of a man who had never seriously questioned whether he belonged anywhere he chose to be. He didn't speak to her for the first 20 minutes. She sat in the passenger seat with her notepad and watched Millhaven pass through the window, the gas stations, the dollar stores, the residential blocks where people moved slowly through cold morning air with their hands stuffed in their pockets. "You from Columbus?" he finally asked. "Originally from Dayton, sir." "Academy finish what month?" "January." He nodded slowly, like he was adding numbers in his head and finding the total unimpressive. "You have any prior experience? Military? Security?" "No, sir. Just the academy." He glanced at her. "How'd you end up in Millhaven?" She let a beat of silence go by, just long enough to seem like the question made her slightly uncomfortable. "I had some family stuff. Needed to be closer to home for a while. This posting was available." Another glance. He was reading her. She could feel it, running her through whatever internal framework he used to categorize people. Inexperienced, somewhat desperate. Chose Millhaven because she couldn't get better. She watched the conclusion settle over his face like weather. "Out here," he said, looking back at the road. "Feelings don't save anyone. Sympathy doesn't keep you or your partner safe. You think something looks wrong, you trust the officer next to you before you trust your own instinct. That's how this department works." "Yes, sir," she said, and wrote 3 words in her notepad. Trust, not judgment. It was the most honest thing he'd said to her. He was already telling her exactly who he was. The first 2 weeks were about construction. Maya built the character the way you build a role. From the ground up, with attention to the small things, because small things are what people actually watch. She fumbled with the patrol car radio twice in front of Stroud, and he passed it around like a joke. She asked a question in briefing that Holloway answered with open impatience, and a few people in the room smiled. She wrote her incident report slightly too slowly, let Falco look over her shoulder once and then correct her on a formatting point she already knew. She was building a reputation as someone who was harmless, someone who was trying hard but not quite making it, someone you didn't need to watch. At the same time, she was watching everything. The recording device she carried was embedded in the inner lining of her badge holder, a modification so precise it had taken a federal technician 4 hours to install, and it was sensitive enough to catch conversation from 12 feet away in ambient noise. Her phone, which looked like a standard department issue model, ran an encrypted backup to a federal server every 6 hours. The notes she took on her paper notepad were written in a personal shorthand that would mean nothing to anyone who looked over her shoulder. She was building a case. She was also building patience, which turned out to be harder. On the 9th day, she saw Holloway pull aside a patrol officer named Greer in the parking lot after a shift. She watched through the side mirror of her car, parked 50 feet away, as Holloway stood close enough that Greer had nowhere to step back to. She couldn't hear those words, but she could read the body language with accuracy. Holloway was issuing an instruction, and Greer was receiving it with the tightened stillness of a person who wants to push back and has already decided they can't afford to. When Holloway walked away, Greer stood in the parking lot for a full 30 seconds without moving. That night, Maya added a note to her encrypted file. Greer, potential witness. Handle carefully. The incident reports she had been assigned to cross-reference were revealing a pattern she had already suspected from the preliminary investigation, but needed documented proof of a cluster of drug possession arrests in the Westgate neighborhood that followed no consistent patrol logic. Too targeted, too productive, statistically impossible, unless someone was either gifted with supernatural instinct or putting the evidence there themselves. 6 arrests in 4 months, all in the same 3-block radius, all discovered by Holloway or officers directly under his supervision. Every arrest documented with the same careful paperwork. Every defendant poor, most of them young, most of them with records that made juries comfortable convicting. She cross-referenced the arrest dates with Holloway's patrol logs and found something else. 2 of the arrest dates didn't match the logs as filed. The paperwork had been adjusted. Not clumsily, whoever did it was careful, but not carefully enough to survive a forensic audit by someone who knew what to look for. Maya sat in her car outside a fast food restaurant on a Tuesday night and looked at the documentation on her encrypted device for a long time. Then she ordered a coffee she didn't particularly want, drank half of it, and drove back to the apartment the federal program had set her up with. A 2-room place on Cloverfield Street that smelled like old carpet and other people's cooking. She called no one. There was no one to call that wasn't a risk. She slept 5 hours, woke before her alarm, and went back. The morning everything accelerated began ordinarily. Patrol rotation, a domestic disturbance call that resolved before they arrived, a traffic accident on Route 9 that required 40 minutes of paperwork. Holloway was in a particular mood, not volatile, but contained in a way that she'd learned to read as controlled irritation, like a pressure system building somewhere behind his eyes. She found out why at 11:14. They were on Fenwick Boulevard when Holloway pulled the car to the curb without warning. 40 yards ahead, a late-model silver sedan had parked in front of a dry cleaner's, and a young man was getting out of the driver's side, early 20s, wearing a college sweatshirt, carrying a backpack, moving with the unhurried ease of someone who had no idea anyone was watching him. "That car's registration is expired," Holloway said. Maya checked the plates on the patrol system. The registration was not expired. She looked at the screen, then at Holloway. "Looks current to me, sir." "I said it's expired." His voice was even. He was already opening the door. She got out on the passenger side and followed him, keeping her face neutral, her heartbeat deliberate and controlled. The young man's name was Darnell Okafor, and he looked at the approaching sergeant with the expression of someone who has been through this before, not fearful, but resigned to a particular kind of inconvenience he knew better than to argue with directly. "Sir," he said calmly, "is there a problem?" "Registration issue. Need to see your license, registration, and proof of insurance." "My registration's current. I just renewed it last month online." "Sir, I'm going to need you to step away from the vehicle." Maya watched. She said nothing. She was positioned at the edge of the encounter, close enough to observe, far enough that Holloway wasn't watching her face. She watched him work, the specific way he directed Darnell to the sidewalk, away from the car, The way he angled his own body to block the young man's sightline back to the vehicle while his hand, quickly, in a movement so practiced it was almost invisible, went briefly into his jacket, almost invisible. Maya's jaw tightened. She kept her face empty. Holloway spent 4 minutes checking documents that were entirely in order, then walked back to the sedan to do what he called a safety inspection. Darnell was kept on the sidewalk. Maya stood nearby, and Holloway's back was to her, and she let her fingers brush against the badge holder at her chest, the one with the recording device, which had been running since the moment the car stopped. When Holloway straightened up from the passenger side of the sedan, his expression had changed. "Got something here." His voice was studiedly neutral. "There's a controlled substance in this vehicle, bagged and tucked under the passenger seat." Darnell's face went very still. "That's not mine." "Sir, I need you to but... That is not mine. I have never..." Darnell stopped himself. He was smart enough to know where this was going. Maya said nothing. She was standing close enough that Holloway glanced at her. A quick, measuring look, the kind that was assessing whether she was going to be a problem. She made sure her face said that she wasn't. Back at the precinct, Holloway dropped a file on her desk. "Okafor incident report. You were on scene. You fill it out." She opened the file, looked at the pre-printed structure, the fields for evidence discovered, officer observations, justification for the search. Looked at the small bag of white powder that had been logged into evidence, which Darnell Okafor had never seen before in his life. "Fill it out," Holloway said again from the doorway. "I'll have it done," she said. He left. Maya sat with the file open in front of her and looked at it for a long time. She thought about Darnell Okafor's face in that moment, the stillness of it, the way he'd caught himself before he said something that would make it worse. She thought about the 6 arrests in Westgate, the adjusted patrol logs, the men whose lives had been redirected by documents like this one. She picked up her pen. She wrote the date, the time, the location. She wrote Darnell Okafor's name. She wrote her badge number. She wrote a precise, accurate account of what she had observed during the traffic stop, what she saw, what she did not see, what she could confirm, and what she could not. And she signed it with her name. Then she put the pen down and waited. Holloway found her at her desk an hour later. He picked up the report, scanned it, read it again. The change in his face was not dramatic. It was too controlled for that. But she could see it happening at the edges, like ice developing hairline fractures. "This isn't what I asked for," he said. "I wrote what I observed, sir." "You were on scene for the entire stop." "Yes, sir." "And this is what you observed." "Yes, sir." The silence between them ran about 4 seconds, which was long enough to establish something that couldn't be unestablished. Holloway set the report down on her desk with deliberate care. "I want you to think very carefully," he said quietly, "about what it means to be a team player in this department." "I won't sign a lie," she said. Her voice was quiet too. Not defiant. Matter of fact. Like she was telling him the weather. He looked at her for a moment that stretched. Then he walked away. So, she knew what was coming next. She had known since she'd walked into this precinct that there would be a moment when the pretense shifted, when she'd have to do something that broke the character she'd been building, because she wasn't willing to cross a line that would ruin an innocent person's life just to protect the cover. That was always the calculation. The federal guidelines were clear: observe and record, do not participate in illegal acts, do not allow a civilian to be materially harmed by your inaction if intervention is possible. She had not participated. She had not confirmed a false story. Darnell Okafor was still in a holding cell pending arraignment, but she had created a documented counter-narrative in the official record that would matter enormously when this case reached a courtroom. She had also, she understood very clearly, made herself a problem. That evening, after her shift ended, she sat in her car in the precinct parking lot and did something she almost never allowed herself. She felt the weight of it. Not fear exactly. Something more like the particular loneliness of being the only person in a room who knows what's actually happening, of doing the right thing in a way that nobody around you can acknowledge. She sat with it for about 3 minutes. Then she started the car and drove home. The next morning, her locker wouldn't open on the first try. Someone had tampered with the combination mechanism, a small juvenile harassment, the kind of message that's designed to let you know you're being noticed. She got it open on the 3rd try and changed without reacting visibly. Stroud passed her in the hallway and didn't acknowledge her. Falco, who had been pointedly friendly during her first 2 weeks, was suddenly unavailable for eye contact. The temperature of the room had shifted overnight with the clean precision of a thermostat adjustment, and everyone in the unit had apparently been informed of the new setting. She went to briefing. She did her shift. She wrote her reports with absolute accuracy. She found it on a Thursday, 7 days after the Okafor incident. She opened her locker at the end of her shift, and there it was, sitting on the shelf above her street clothes, between a spare notepad and the protein bar she'd put there 3 days ago. A handgun. Not her service weapon, which was still holstered at her side. A different one. Older, with the serial number filed in a particular way that would be immediately significant to anyone who knew what to look for. She did not touch it. She stood in front of the open locker and looked at it for exactly the amount of time it took her to understand what had been arranged. Then she closed the locker, made sure it latched, and walked to the break room where she got a paper cup of water and stood at the window and looked at the parking lot for 2 minutes. They were going to claim she'd stolen it, or that she'd brought it in, or that she'd been carrying it without authorization. There were several versions of this story available to them, and they had the institutional apparatus to make any of those versions stick. She had also, she realized, been underestimating how fast they moved. She walked back to her locker, opened it, and photographed everything with the phone that backed up to a federal server every 6 hours. She documented the position of the weapon, the condition of the locker, the surrounding items. She called no one. Any call she made from inside this building would be a risk. She logged the discovery in her encrypted notes with timestamp and detail. Then she closed the locker again and went back to finish her paperwork. She was still at her desk at 6:47 p.m. when Holloway came through the door with Lieutenant Marcus Vale behind him, and 2 other officers flanking wide, a specific formation, the kind people use when they've decided not to leave anything to chance. Officer Whitaker. Holloway's voice was entirely comfortable. He was back on familiar ground. Stand up, please. She stood. We've received a report regarding unauthorized possession of department property. He was watching her face, she knew, for the reaction that would tell him whether she was going to fold or fight. We'll need you to accompany us. Every officer in the room had gone very still. The ones who were Holloway's people were watching with the barely concealed satisfaction of people watching something go exactly as planned. Torres, across the room, had her hands flat on her desk and her eyes on the middle distance. Maya looked at Holloway. Of course, she said, and the steadiness of her own voice was something she would think about later. Not with pride exactly, but with the particular satisfaction of knowing that the one thing he could not plan for was the thing she'd been practicing for longer than he'd been aware she existed. She let them walk her out. She let the handcuffs snap around her wrists in front of the entire floor. She walked through the precinct with her hands locked behind her back and the eyes of 30 officers on her, and she let them put her in the interrogation room and leave her there with the door closed and the overhead light too bright and the table bolted to the floor. She sat down. She breathed. She thought about what she needed them to do next and whether they were going to do it. The door stayed closed for 11 minutes. She counted. Then Holloway came in alone, pulled out the chair across from her, and sat down like a man settling in for a conversation he'd been looking forward to. Here's what's going to happen, he said. She looked at him across the table, this man with his 18 commendations and his newspaper feature and his 22 years of institutional protection, and she thought, you walked right in. I'm listening, Maya Whitaker said, and the recording device in her badge holder caught every word. Here's what's going to happen, Holloway said, and he set both hands flat on the table like a man laying down a deed to property he already owned. You're going to tell me where you got that weapon, and you're going to do it before this goes any further. Maya looked at him. The overhead light was making everything in the room look slightly worse than it actually was. Washed out, institutional, the kind of light designed not for comfort but for visibility, so that nobody in this room could hide anything. She'd read somewhere that interrogation room lighting was specifically calibrated to create mild physiological stress in the person being questioned. She believed it. She just happened to be someone who had spent 4 months in federal training, learning to sit in exactly this kind of room with exactly this kind of person across from her and keep her baseline steady. I didn't bring any weapon in, she said. I found it in my locker. I don't know who put it there. That's a very convenient answer. It's the accurate one. Holloway's jaw shifted slightly forward, the tell she'd cataloged in the first week. He'd been expecting something else from her, either a collapse or a sharper confrontation, something he could work with. Her flatness was making him recalibrate, and he didn't like having to recalibrate. "You've been on this job for 3 weeks," he said. "In 3 weeks, you've already demonstrated that you have a problem following established procedure. You filed a report that directly contradicted your supervising officer's account. You've been uncooperative with unit culture. And now there's an unauthorized firearm in your assigned locker." He paused. "How do you think this looks?" "I think it looks like someone put a weapon in my locker," she said. Which is what happened. He stood up, which was a power move she'd been expecting. It's harder to maintain eye contact with someone who's suddenly above you, and most people instinctively look up, which puts them in a slightly subordinate physical position. She kept her eyes level, at the space where his face had been, then calmly adjusted her gaze upward without any of the flinching that the movement was designed to produce. "I want you to think," Holloway said quietly, "about your future in this department, about whether this is the hill you actually want to die on." "I'd like to know what I'm being formally charged with," she said. The pause that followed was brief, but it was there. "You're not being charged with anything yet." "Then I'd like to be uncuffed." He looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he went to the door, opened it, said something to whoever was standing outside, and 30 seconds later an officer she didn't recognize came in and removed the handcuffs. Holloway left without another word, which told her more than anything he'd said. He hadn't expected to need to charge her tonight because he'd expected her to break. She hadn't broken. He needed to regroup. She rubbed her wrists, looked at the table, let herself breathe. Round 1 was over. She had not won it. Nobody wins an interrogation room in the first session, but she hadn't lost it either, which was all she'd needed to accomplish. What she needed now was to not be in this precinct any longer than she had to be. They released her at 9:20 p.m. with a notice that the incident was under internal review, which was the procedural equivalent of a sword held above someone's head. Not dropped yet, but there. She signed the acknowledgement form with her left hand slightly unsteady, which was genuine and which she didn't try to hide, because being visibly rattled in this moment was accurate, and because pretending you weren't shaken when you were was a mistake people made when they confused emotional control with emotional concealment. She drove home in the dark, checked her mirrors twice at each major intersection. Not paranoid, operational. When she got to the apartment on Cloverfield Street, she sat in the parked car for 4 minutes and ran through her options with the detachment of someone doing inventory. The weapon in the locker had been photographed and documented before anyone official had touched it. The recording device had captured Holloway's interrogation. The Okafor incident report was in the official record. Her encrypted file contained 3 weeks of documented observations with timestamps, and that file was synced to a federal server that Holloway had no knowledge of and no access to. She was not in a good position, but she was not in an unworkable one. What she was, sitting in a parked car outside an apartment that smelled like other people's cooking, was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. She was tired of performing. She was tired of writing reports that no one around her believed, of eating lunch alone in the break room because the social cost of sitting with someone who'd contradicted Holloway was apparently too high for most of them to pay. She was tired of watching Darnell Okafor's face in her memory, that stillness, that caught breath, and knowing he was sitting in a holding cell right now because she hadn't been able to stop it, only document it. She went inside. She ate something she couldn't really taste. She went through her encrypted files for 40 minutes, adding the details of the interrogation while they were still precise, and then she set an alarm for 5:30 and lay down on the bed without changing clothes and stared at the ceiling until sleep found her about an hour later. The next 4 days were a different kind of pressure. Nobody confronted her. Nobody said anything directly. But the mechanics of exclusion in a closed institutional environment are precise and effective. She was left off a group message about a schedule change and showed up to the wrong briefing room, which cost her 12 minutes and a note in her file about punctuality. Her patrol car was reassigned without notice, and when she asked Ruiz at the desk about it, he looked at his computer screen with the careful blankness of a man who had been told not to be helpful. In the locker room, a conversation that had been happening stopped when she walked in and resumed at reduced volume after a few seconds. She documented all of it. Every omission, every redirection, every small coordinated discourtesy. She wrote it down with dates and times in her shorthand, because a pattern is only a pattern if you can demonstrate its consistency, and she intended to be able to demonstrate it. On the third day, Officer Torres stopped her in the hallway outside the women's locker room. Torres was compact and careful, a 6-year veteran who had not been part of Holloway's inner circle, but who also hadn't been visibly opposed to it. The particular neutral zone occupied by people who are not corrupt, but who are also not yet brave enough to be something else. "I just want to say," Torres started, and then stopped, and then tried again. "I saw the Okafor report. What you wrote." Maya waited. "That took something," Torres said. It wasn't exactly a compliment. It was more like a statement of observed fact, delivered with the precision of someone who had been very careful about how much they were committing to. "That's all I wanted to say." She walked away before Maya could respond, which was smart. Plausible deniability required short conversations in empty hallways, not extended exchanges that someone might witness and interpret. Maya stood where she was for a moment after Torres left. She thought about what that conversation had cost Torres to initiate and what it might cost her later. She added a note to her encrypted file. Torres. Separate from core group. Observing. May be reachable. She did not allow herself to feel encouraged, because encouragement made you move too fast, and moving too fast broke cases. The Internal Review Board notice arrived in her departmental inbox on a Thursday. It was formal, template-heavy, official-sounding, the kind of document that was designed to look like a process while actually being an outcome. Because the people running the review were the people she was investigating, and the independence of the process was entirely theoretical. She was required to appear for a formal hearing in 11 days. She read the notice twice. Then she went to the bathroom, stood at the sink, ran cold water over her wrists for about 30 seconds, and looked at her face in the mirror. She looked like someone who had been under sustained pressure for a month, which she was. The cover persona she'd constructed was wearing down at the edges in ways she hadn't entirely planned for. There's only so long you can inhabit a version of yourself that's smaller than the actual thing without it costing something. She dried her hands, went back to her desk. There was a message on her departmental computer, internal, from Lieutenant Vale's administrative account, formally notifying her that her patrol assignments had been adjusted pending review, and that she would be on desk duty only until the hearing concluded, which meant she was being removed from any position where she might observe things, which meant they were starting to understand that she had been observing things, which meant the timeline was compressing in ways she hadn't fully controlled. She needed to move faster, not recklessly, never recklessly, but faster. That evening, she drove to a gas station 15 miles outside Mill Haven, paid cash for a prepaid calling card, used a payphone that she was reasonably confident wasn't in any surveillance network, and made a call to a number she had memorized 6 months ago. It rang 4 times. Then, "Yes." "It's accelerating," she said. "They've moved to desk only. Internal review in 11 days. A pause on the other end. "How's the documentation?" "Strong, but incomplete on the financial side. I don't have the chain on where the planted evidence is sourced. We have some of that from the financial records. It may be enough. I need more time." "You have 11 days before the hearing." Another pause. "Can you give us something that changes the calculus before then?" She thought about Darnell Okafor in a holding cell. She thought about the 6 arrests in Westgate, the adjusted patrol logs. She thought about the conversation she'd had with Torres in the hallway, and what Torres might know that she hadn't yet said. "Possibly," she said. "Be careful." The voice on the other end was even, professional, devoid of sentiment. "We can't pull you out until we have enough to hold them. If you come out early, they walk." "I know," Maya said. She hung up. Drove back to Mill Haven. Sat in the parking lot of her apartment building and looked at the lights in the windows above her and thought about the version of her life that existed on the other side of this assignment. The one where she was allowed to be fully herself in rooms. The one where she could call someone and say, "I'm tired," without doing the math first on whether the call was safe. She went inside. She slept. She went back. On the 7th day after the interrogation, she found Officer Greer standing next to her car in the precinct parking lot at end of shift. I wasn't leaning against it. He was standing near it in a way that was designed to look accidental, like he'd just stopped to check his phone, but his car was 40 yards away and the physics of it didn't work. She approached. He looked up like he was surprised to see her, which was not a convincing performance. "Whitaker," he said. "Greer." He looked around the parking lot with the specific anxiety of someone who has rehearsed this moment and is now finding that the real version is harder than the rehearsal. You doing okay? I'm fine. Because. He stopped, started again. Because things are it's a bit of a strange situation right now, with the review. It's a process, she said neutrally. Right. He was working up to something. She could see it. The preparatory breathing, the way he kept his eyes slightly averted, the hands going in and out of his pockets. I want you to know that not everybody here thinks the same way about how things have been handled. She said nothing. She let the silence do the work. The Okafor stop, he said, quiet enough that she had to focus slightly to catch it. I've seen that play out before. Different name, different street. It's not the first time. Her heartbeat was entirely steady. She had trained for exactly this moment, the witness who comes to you, the one you have to handle so precisely that one wrong word sends them back to silence forever. I hear you, she said. I'm not saying I'll do anything. I have a kid. I have a mortgage. He exhaled. I'm just saying you're not crazy. For what you wrote, you're not wrong. She looked at him, saw the cost of what he was doing. Not the dramatic cost, not the movie version, but the real one. A man standing in a parking lot with his hands in his pockets, saying something true to someone he barely knew because the weight of not saying it had apparently become heavier than the risk. I appreciate you telling me that, she said, carefully. If you ever decide you want to say something more formal, I mean that. It's a decision only you can make. He nodded once, sharply, like he was sealing something. Then he walked to his car without looking back. She stood in the parking lot for a moment after he was gone. The evening air was cold and flat, and somewhere down the block someone was mowing a lawn at 7 in the evening, the sound incongruously domestic against everything else. She added Greer to her mental calculation, not as a committed witness, not yet, but as a possibility. A door that was slightly more open than it had been. She got in her car. She drove home. She updated her files. 3 days before the internal review hearing, the escalation she'd been anticipating arrived from a direction she hadn't entirely expected. She came in for her desk shift at 7:30 to find a note on her keyboard. Paper, handwritten, unsigned, 4 words. They're moving the evidence. She read it once, folded it into her pocket with her hand covering the motion, and went to the bathroom where she photographed it and added it to her encrypted record before anything else. The handwriting she didn't recognize. The paper was standard office stock. There was no way to trace it, which meant whoever had written it either didn't know how to be more specific or had deliberately kept it vague enough that they could deny it. Moving the evidence could mean a dozen things. In context, she read it as meaning the physical evidence from the Okafor stop, the planted substance, the chain of custody documentation, was being altered or relocated before the internal review, which would mean they were trying to eliminate the physical through line that connected Holloway's account to what had actually happened. She thought about this for 2 minutes, sitting in a bathroom stall. Then she went back to her desk and started working, and she spent the first 2 hours of her shift looking busy while she thought through what she needed to do and how fast she needed to do it. The evidence room at the Millhaven PD was logged through a tracking system that was, by all appearances, secure, but she had spent part of her first week making friends with the administrative structure of the precinct the way you make friends with any system, by learning its habits, its assumptions, its points of friction. The evidence tracking software logged checkouts by badge number and timestamp. If someone was moving or altering logged evidence, there would be a record of access. Getting to that record was a different problem, because it required either direct access to the administrative system, which her desk assignment didn't give her, or someone who had that access and was willing to use it. Torres. Torres had been in the administrative rotation 2 months before Maya arrived. Torres had database access that was still active because nobody had gotten around to restricting it, which Maya knew because she had been very careful during her first week about learning which officers had which system permissions, which had seemed like basic operational diligence at the time and now felt like foresight. The question was whether Torres was there yet, whether what had happened in the hallway that took something was the beginning of something or just a moment that wasn't going to go any further. Maya spent 3 hours at her desk not calling Torres over, not approaching her directly, not doing anything that would put Torres in a position before Torres had decided she was ready to be in one. At 11:47, Torres came to the coffee station 6 feet from Maya's desk. She made coffee with the unhurried precision of someone who wasn't doing anything particular. Then she set a mug down on Maya's desk on her way back. "Machine's better than the break room one," Torres said, and walked away. Maya looked at the mug, picked it up, drank. Then she looked at Torres across the room, caught her eye for exactly 1 second, and gave the smallest possible nod. Torres looked back at her screen. That afternoon, Maya found a folded piece of paper tucked under the edge of her keyboard when she came back from the bathroom. It wasn't a note. It was a printout, 3 lines of data from the evidence tracking system, showing a checkout entry for the Okafor evidence log at 11:14 p.m. 2 nights ago, under a badge number that she recognized without needing to look it up. Lieutenant Marcus Vale. Evidence checked out at 11:14 p.m., returned at 11:52 p.m., 38 minutes. During which time anything could have happened to anything inside those bags. The checkout was logged, but there was no notation of purpose, no audit code, no associated case review number. Just the access entry floating there in the record like a breath held too long. Maya photographed the printout. She added it to her encrypted file. She sat with what she now had and ran the arithmetic of it. The original documentation of the planted evidence, her contemporaneous incident report, the pattern of Westgate arrests, the adjusted patrol logs, Greer's parking lot admission, Torres's printout. And the sum of it was not yet sufficient for federal charges, but it was getting close, closer than she'd been 72 hours ago. And the internal review was in 3 days. And the people she was investigating had started moving evidence at 11 o'clock at night, which meant they were feeling some kind of pressure she hadn't entirely accounted for. She needed to know where that pressure was coming from. She found out the next morning. She arrived at the precinct at 7 to find the place humming with a particular energy, not the operational energy of an active emergency, but the social energy of information circulating through a closed system, which in a police precinct sounds like lowered voices and avoided eye contact and a specific kind of busyness that is actually people finding reasons to be somewhere they can talk. She got to her desk. Within 20 minutes, she had assembled the picture from ambient fragments, a snippet of conversation between Stroud and Falco near the supply room, a comment from the front desk officer on a phone call he didn't lower his voice for, a departmental notice that hit everyone's email at 8:04. The county district attorney's office was conducting an independent review of 3 cases prosecuted using evidence developed from Millhaven PD arrests. The review had been initiated in response to a civil lawsuit filed on behalf of 2 of the 6 Westgate defendants, who had obtained new legal representation and were alleging evidence irregularities in their original prosecutions. It was not the federal investigation. It was something adjacent to it, a separate thread, pulled by a different set of hands, arriving at a different angle. And its existence meant that the world outside this precinct was beginning to notice the same things Maya had been documenting for a month. Holloway was not in the building that morning. His absence had the quality of a deliberate choice. Vale was in his office with the door closed. She could see him through the narrow window beside the door frame. On his phone, standing, not sitting, the posture of a man having a conversation he's not in control of. She went to her desk. She opened her encrypted notes on the phone that backed up to a federal server every 6 hours. She began writing, quickly and precisely, a summary document. Everything she had, organized by category, with cross-references and timestamps, in a format that a federal attorney could read and use. She had started this summary twice before and stopped because the documentation wasn't complete enough. She was starting it now because 3 days before a hearing that was designed to end her career, with Vale moving evidence in the middle of the night and the DA's office independently pulling at the same thread, the window she had was closing, and what she put through it in the next 72 hours was going to matter enormously. She was at 40% of the document when the email arrived. It came to her departmental account from a sender she didn't immediately recognize. An external address, not internal, not the federal program, nothing she'd been given. The subject line was blank. She almost deleted it. Instead, she opened it because something about the timing made her careful. The email contained 3 sentences. You should know that Internal Affairs at the state level received an anonymous tip about your operation 6 days ago. Someone inside the precinct knows you're not who you say you are. Get your evidence out. She read it twice. The chair she was sitting in was completely still, and the room around her was the ordinary noise of a precinct mid-morning, and her face gave nothing away, but her mind was running very fast through the implications. Someone inside the precinct knew, not suspected. Knew. The tip to state internal affairs had been specific enough to constitute knowledge, not inference, which meant whoever had sent it had access to something, a name, a file, a conversation that shouldn't have been accessible to anyone in this building. Her cover had a leak she hadn't identified. She closed the email, sat for a moment, looked at the room around her, at Stroud reading something on his phone, at Falco getting coffee, at the front desk officer, at the closed door of Vale's office, at Torres across the room with her eyes on her computer screen. One of the people in this building knew what she actually was, and she had no idea which one. She opened her encrypted notes and added one line, time-stamped, cover may be compromised, timeline critical. Need extraction decision within 48 hours or evidence transfer now. Then she looked up at the room again, at all the ordinary faces of ordinary people going through an ordinary morning, and understood with complete clarity that she was about to find out whether the past month of careful, painstaking, documented work was going to be enough, or whether someone had just moved the endgame up by 72 hours, and she was the last one to know it. The 48 hours she'd given herself lasted 19. She spent the rest of that morning at her desk with the summary document open on her encrypted phone under the desk surface, adding to it in short intervals between the ordinary desk work she was still required to perform, filing cross-references, updating patrol log summaries, the mundane administrative rhythm of someone who had been benched and was doing what benched people do. She kept her face the same. She answered the 2 questions directed at her by other officers with the same slightly subdued politeness she'd been performing for a month. She did not look at Torres. She did not look at Greer. She looked at her work and thought about the email and ran through the list of people who could have known. The federal operation had 4 people read in at the Millhaven level. Her direct handler, 2 technicians who had set up her devices, and a supervising agent in Columbus who held the classified brief. None of those 4 had any reason to leak to state internal affairs. And more importantly, none of them had any reason to warn her about it if they had. The email she'd received was not from federal infrastructure. The address was external. The phrasing was personal. The decision to send it was not institutional. Someone had done that independently, which meant the leak wasn't upward, it was lateral. Someone inside the precinct, or close enough to it to have access to something, who knew what she was and had decided that warning her was more important than whatever the alternative was. She didn't have enough information to figure out who. She also didn't have time to figure it out before it became irrelevant. At 2:17 p.m., she finished the summary document. It was 31 pages of organized, time-stamped, cross-referenced documentation. Everything she had collected in 31 days, structured for a federal attorney to read and act on. She encrypted it with the protocol she'd been given and transmitted it through the phone's secure channel to the federal server. Then she sat at her desk for 30 seconds and felt the particular hollowness of having done the thing you've been building toward, and having it leave you not with satisfaction, but with the awareness of how much remains. She went home at end of shift. She made herself eat. She slept 6 hours, which was more than she expected. At 4 in the morning, she woke to a sound that wasn't an alarm. A vehicle outside, idling longer than vehicles idled on Cloverfield Street at 4 a.m. She lay in the dark and listened to it. 90 seconds. Then it moved on. She got up, went to the window, saw nothing, went back to bed and lay there with her eyes open until the alarm went off at 5:30. She arrived at the precinct at 7:04. She noticed 3 things immediately. Holloway was back, standing near the briefing room door with a coffee cup and the particular stillness of someone who had spent the night deciding something. Vale was already at his desk, which was unusual. Vale typically arrived at 7:30. And the officer who usually managed the front desk, a steady, unaffiliated man named Dorsey, had been replaced by Falco. She went to her desk. She logged into her workstation. She was reading through an administrative notice about updated evidence handling procedures, which struck her as acutely specific given the last 48 hours, when Holloway appeared at her desk at 7:22. "Come with me," he said. She followed him to the conference room, which was not the interrogation room. A different space, longer table, more chairs, the kind of room used for briefings and meetings rather than for isolating people. Vale was already there, seated at the far end. The door closed behind her. Holloway sat down across from her and looked at her with the expression of a man who had arrived at a decision and was now executing it without ambiguity. "We're moving your review hearing up," he said. "It's happening this afternoon." She kept her face neutral. The notice said 11 days. "Circumstances have changed. This is within procedural authority." He slid a document across the table, a form, signatures at the bottom including the department chief's. "You'll have the opportunity to present your account before a 3-person review panel at 2 p.m. A 3-person review panel consisting, she had no doubt, of people chosen by Holloway. An accelerated hearing with 6 hours of notice. The kind of maneuver that was procedurally valid and substantively a closing of a trap. She picked up the document, read it, set it down. "I'll be there," she said. Holloway nodded once, started to stand. "The evidence from the Okafor stop," she said. "Will that be part of the review record?" He paused in the motion of standing, just for a fraction of a second, but she caught it. "The relevant evidence will be presented," he said. "That's how a review works." "Of course," she said. He left. Vale followed without having said a single word, which told her that Vale's role in this meeting had been as a witness, not a participant, someone whose presence established that the notification had been properly delivered. They were being careful about the procedure. They were being careful because the DA's office review had made them careful. She sat in the empty conference room for exactly the amount of time it took her to think through what the next 6 hours needed to look like. She had one asset she hadn't used yet. She'd been holding it back because using it prematurely would cost Torres more than Maya was willing to spend without necessity. But a hearing in 6 hours with panel members selected by the people she was investigating was not a circumstance that left room for conservation. She found Torres in the hallway outside the women's locker room at 7:58. The same location as the first conversation, which was not an accident. Maya had moved through her morning in a path that would bring her past this hallway at this time without it looking deliberate. Torres saw her coming. Something moved in her expression. A recognition, a bracing. "I have a hearing at 2, Maya said, keeping her voice level and her eyes straight. She didn't stop walking entirely. She slowed to the pace of someone in conversation, which looked like 2 colleagues talking in passing. They moved it up this morning, 6 hours notice. "I heard," Torres said. "The Okafor evidence was accessed 11 days ago, 38 minutes, no audit code." Torres's jaw tightened fractionally. "I know what I gave you." "I know you do." Maya kept walking, same pace. "I need to know if there's anything else in that log. Anything before the Okafor arrest. Same access pattern, different case numbers." Torres didn't answer immediately. They were at the corner where it opened onto the main floor. If either of them kept walking, the conversation was over. Torres stopped. She was looking at the floor. 6 entries, she said quietly. "Going back 14 months. I didn't give you those because I wasn't sure." "Are you sure now?" A long pause. "If I give you that, I'm done here. You understand that?" "I understand it." "My kid's in 3rd grade. Maya stopped walking too. She turned to face Torres directly, which she hadn't done yet. Full eye contact. No performance. "What you give me ends this. It doesn't just end my hearing. The entire thing ends. The people doing this to civilians, to your colleagues, it ends." Torres looked at her for a moment that stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. Then she looked away, back at the floor, and her voice when she spoke was very quiet and very steady. "Check your desk drawer in 20 minutes, bottom right." She walked onto the main floor and back to her workstation without another word or a backward glance. Maya waited 30 seconds, then followed at a different angle. The printout was in her desk drawer at 8:23. 6 evidence access entries, 14 months of irregular after-hours activity, a pattern so clear in aggregate that the only reason it hadn't triggered an audit review was that each individual entry, taken alone, was within operational tolerance. Together, they constituted a documented chain of evidence tampering that predated the Okafor arrest by over a year. She photographed everything. She transmitted it through the secure channel. Then she walked to the bathroom and stood at the sink and ran cold water over her wrists for a minute. The same thing she'd done after the internal review notice. The same small physical reset she'd learned to use when the circumstances required her to be completely functional, and she needed to help her body catch up with what her mind had already decided to do. She had 4 hours and 37 minutes before the hearing. She used them. She spent the first 2 hours making sure the documentation she'd transmitted was complete and organized in a way that left no ambiguity about the chain of evidence, that every recorded conversation, every time-stamped note, every photographed document, every access log entry was cross-referenced so that the picture assembled itself for whoever was reading it on the other end. She had been trained in evidence packaging, and she applied that training with the focus of someone who understood that the quality of this document was going to determine outcomes for people other than herself. At 10:40, she went to the break room and made coffee she didn't need, and stood at the window for 8 minutes and thought about Greer. He had told her she wasn't wrong. He had said he couldn't do anything. He had a kid and a mortgage, and the specific vulnerability of a man who has watched what happens to people who step out of line in an institution that takes care of its own and destroys those who stop cooperating. She wasn't going to ask him to testify. What she needed from Greer was different. She needed him to not do anything in the next 4 hours that would give Holloway and Vale additional ammunition. She needed him to hold his position without doing anything that would cost him more than he could afford. She didn't approach him. She decided, sitting with the coffee she didn't need, that Greer would do what Greer would do, and that the most responsible thing she could do with the 90 minutes she had before she needed to be in that hearing room was to make sure everything she'd built over the past month was solid enough to stand without needing Greer or Torres or anyone else inside this building to confirm it. At 1:15, she went to the women's locker room and stood at the mirror and did something she'd been waiting for since she'd walked into this precinct 31 days ago. She opened her locker, reached to the back of the top shelf, and took out the badge holder, the real one, the federal one, with her actual credentials. She held it for a moment. Then she put it in her jacket pocket. She checked the recording device and the other badge holder, the one she'd been wearing for a month, and confirmed it was running. She went to the conference room at 1:55. The review panel was exactly who she'd expected, a deputy chief named Hartley, who was 4 months from retirement and had the expression of a man who had learned to make peace with institutional outcomes. A senior patrol officer named Rice, who was visibly uncomfortable and wouldn't look directly at her, and a human resources administrator named Paulson, who was taking notes on a laptop with the careful efficiency of someone whose job was to document whatever happened regardless of what it was. Holloway was not on the panel. He was seated to the side, positioned as a witness and reporting officer, which was technically correct and practically meaningless as a distinction. Vale was there too, same position. Hartley opened the proceeding with a summary of the charges: unauthorized possession of a service weapon, failure to follow direct supervisor instruction in the field, conduct unbecoming. He read it in the tone of a man reading a menu in a restaurant. He didn't choose, covering the items without particular investment in any of them. Maya sat across the table from the panel and listened. She had her hands folded on the table in front of her. She was not performing nervousness anymore. There was no point, and she was tired of the performance. She sat the way she actually sat, which was still and straight and attentive in a way that was slightly different from how she'd been carrying herself for the past month. Holloway noticed. She saw him notice. "Officer Whitaker," Hartley said, "you have the opportunity to respond to each of the charges. Would you like to begin?" "Yes," she said. "But first I'd like to ask a question about the evidence that's been presented." Hartley looked at her over his reading glasses. "Proceed. The weapon found in my locker, has the chain of custody for that item been established? I'd like to know specifically when it entered the evidence log." A pause. Hartley looked at Holloway, who looked back with the controlled expression of someone who has anticipated a problem and prepared for it. "The weapon was logged when you were processed," Holloway said. "And before that? Before it was found in my locker?" "We're not here to relitigate the discovery. I'm asking about provenance," she said, calm, factual. "If a weapon was found in my possession, I'd expect the panel to want to know where it came from before it was in my possession. That seems like a fairly basic evidentiary question." Hartley frowned. He wrote something down. Rice, across the table, was looking at his hands. "The panel will consider relevance," Hartley said, which was not a yes and not a no. "I have documentation," she said, "that I'd like to submit to the panel. Regarding the Okafor traffic stop, the chain of custody for the evidence collected at that stop, and several related incidents involving evidence handling in this department going back 14 months. The room changed. It didn't change dramatically. Nothing flipped over, nobody stood up. But the air shifted the way air shifts when a pressure system moves through, a change in the ambient quality of the space that everyone in the room felt and nobody acknowledged out loud. Holloway's voice was very controlled. This review is not a venue for... I'd like to know, Paulson, the HR administrator, said quietly, still looking at her laptop screen, what kind of documentation? Everyone looked at Paulson. Paulson looked at Maya. Incident reports, evidence access logs, time-stamped audio recordings, and field notes spanning 31 days, Maya said. Hartley set down his pen. Officer Whitaker, this panel was convened to address specific charges. If you're suggesting a broader investigative matter... I'm not suggesting it, she said. I'm telling you that I've been collecting evidence of systematic evidence tampering, falsification of arrest records, and civil rights violations conducted by officers in this department for the past month. The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. In institutional time, that's a long time. She reached into her jacket pocket. Not for the federal badge, not yet. She set her phone on the table and slid it to Paulson. 47 separate documented incidents. Everything transmitted to a federal server this morning, so this device is a backup only. You're welcome to review any of it. Paulson looked at the phone, looked at Hartley. Didn't touch the phone. Holloway pushed his chair back and stood up. He had made a decision, and his body was ahead of his words. This is completely outside the scope. Sergeant? Hartley's voice, for the first time, had an edge. He was looking at Holloway with the expression of a man who has spent 30 years reading rooms and is reading this one. Sit down, please. Holloway sat. His jaw was set in the forward position. The tell and the muscles along his neck were visible. I want to be very specific, Maya said, and her voice was the flattest it had been in 31 days, stripped of every layer of the performance. About what I'm telling this panel. I'm not making an allegation. I'm reporting the completion of a documented federal investigation, and I'm doing it here because this hearing was convened this morning with 6 hours' notice in what I believe was a deliberate attempt to terminate my employment before that documentation could be formally acted on. The hearing room was completely quiet. Hartley had his pen in his hand and wasn't writing anything. Rice had finally looked up from his hands and was looking at her with the expression of a man watching something he's not sure how to categorize. Paulson's fingers were hovering over her laptop keyboard. I need everyone in this room, Maya said, to understand what comes next. She took out the federal badge holder, set it on the table, opened it. The next 20 minutes were not cinematic. That was the thing nobody told you about the moment of revelation. It wasn't a clean, dramatic beat. It wasn't orchestrated. It was messy and human and complicated in the way that real things are when they finally surface after being underwater for a long time. Hartley asked 3 questions in succession, all of which were essentially the same question rephrased. Are you telling me you're a federal agent? She answered them all the same way. Paulson stopped taking notes and then started taking notes again, which seemed like the right instinct. Rice said nothing and turned slightly gray. Holloway said, "This is," and stopped. He said it 2 more times. The 3rd time he didn't stop, and what came out was, "This is not valid. She has no authority to conduct a federal operation without notifying departmental command." Notification of departmental command, Maya said, is specifically excluded when departmental command is the subject of the investigation. His face did something complicated. It wasn't fear. She didn't think Holloway did fear in the conventional way, but it was something adjacent to it. Something that happened when a man who has spent 22 years operating with the conviction that he is untouchable is forced to process, in real time, the possibility that he was wrong. You should get your attorney on the phone, she said to him. Not cruelty, just information. He looked at her across the table. He was going to say something. She could see the construction of it, and she watched him decide against it. This panel, Hartley said slowly, does not have the authority to... We need to... He put down his pen. We need to pause this proceeding. You can pause it, Maya said. But I want it on record that the documentation I transmitted this morning is now in federal hands, and any interference with evidence or personnel in this department between now and formal federal action will be documented and prosecuted. You're threatening us, Vale said from the side. The first thing he'd said since the meeting started. I'm informing you, she said. There's a difference. You might want to learn it. Hartley was already on his phone, stepping away from the table. Paulson closed her laptop. Rice sat very still with his hands in his lap. Holloway stood up again, and this time nobody told him to sit down. He walked to the door. He put his hand on the handle. He turned back to look at her, and his expression had finally resolved into something readable. Not anger, not the contempt she'd been watching him perform for a month, but something rawer and less composed, the face of a man who has just understood the distance between where he thought he was standing and where he actually was. You should have checked who I really was, Maya said. He opened the door and walked out. Vale stayed. He was looking at the table surface, and he was very still, and his hands were flat on his thighs in the posture of a man who has already begun calculating, with the particular precision of someone who knows when a ship is going down, how much distance he can put between himself and the person who built it. The door Holloway had opened swung slowly closed on its pneumatic hinge. Maya sat in the hearing room with the federal badge open on the table in front of her and listened to Hartley on the phone in the corner, and for a moment, just a moment, between what had already happened and what was about to. The room was very quiet. Then Hartley turned around. His face was the color of old concrete. There are federal agents, he said, and his voice had the stunned quality of a man repeating something he's been told because he hasn't yet fully processed it, in the parking lot. Maya looked at him. They've been there since this morning, she said. Hartley stared at her. Since the hearing was moved up, yes. He looked at the door, looked back at her, opened his mouth, closed it. From somewhere below them, through the floor, through the walls, with the muffled but unmistakable quality of coordinated movement in a building that was built for exactly this kind of acoustics, she heard the sound of the front precinct doors opening. Not one person, not the ordinary sound of shift change or a civilian coming in. The specific weighted sound of multiple people moving with purpose through an entrance, the kind of sound that a building knows how to transmit even when you can't see what's causing it. Hartley took a step backward. Vale stood up from his chair very quickly, knocking it into the wall behind him, and his face in that moment was stripped of everything it had been wearing for the past month. The careful deference, the managed composure, the alliance. And what was underneath was just a man looking at the door and understanding that whatever was on the other side of it had already made his choices for him. The door to the conference room opened, and Maya Whitaker, who had spent 31 days being the most overlooked person in this building, stood up from her chair and turned to face it. The door opened and 3 people came through it, and none of them looked like what movies had trained people to expect from a federal entry. No tactical gear, no weapons drawn, no theatrical announcing of presence. 2 men and a woman in dark suits, moving with the contained efficiency of people who had been in many rooms like this one and had learned that composure was more effective than spectacle. The woman in front was holding credentials that she displayed briefly to Hartley without breaking stride. Special Agent Renata Voss, FBI Civil Rights Division, she said. This proceeding is concluded. Hartley said nothing. He had the look of a man watching a weather system he'd been warned about make landfall. Voss looked at Maya. Something passed between them. Not warmth exactly, but recognition, the particular acknowledgement between professionals who have been working the same problem from different angles and have finally arrived at the same room. You holding up? Yes, Maya said. Good. We need you. Voss turned to the 2 agents behind her and said something in a low voice, then looked at Vale, who was still standing near the upended chair with his hands at his sides. Lieutenant Vale, sit down, please. Someone will be in to speak with you shortly. Vale sat. The chair was still slightly angled from where he'd knocked it, and he didn't straighten it, just folded himself into it with the careful movements of a man trying to take up as little space as possible. Whatever calculation he'd been running in his head for the past 10 minutes had apparently arrived at a conclusion because the combative stillness she'd watched him maintain through the hearing had dissolved into something quieter and more frightened. Maya picked up her federal badge from the table, closed it, put it in her pocket. She picked up the phone, the one she'd slid to Paulson, which no one had touched, and she followed Agent Voss out of the conference room and into the hallway, and the first thing she heard was voices from the main floor below, not shouting, but the specific elevated register of multiple conversations happening simultaneously in a space that had gone from ordinary to very much not ordinary. How many did you bring? She asked Voss as they moved toward the stairwell. 12 in the building, 4 outside. We have a unit at Holloway's home address as a precaution. Voss pushed the stairwell door open. He didn't leave the building. He went to his office, locked the door. He's calling his attorney. Almost certainly. We'll give him 4 minutes. Voss glanced at her. You got everything out this morning? Transmitted at 0800, and Torres gave me the extended access logs, 14 months of irregular evidence handling. I sent those separately at 11. We have them. They're good, Maya. The forensic accountant spent the morning with the financial thread, and what you gave us closes a gap we've had since February. A pause. You did the job. It was said without ceremony, the same way you'd confirm a measurement, and that was exactly how she received it. Not as praise, as information. Verification that the thing she'd spent 31 days building in isolation, with no external confirmation and no permission to show it to anyone, had actually been what she thought it was. They came out on the main floor. The main floor of the Millhaven PD at 2:34 p.m. Looked like an institution in the process of understanding that its architecture had changed. 6 federal agents were distributed across the space in positions that were not aggressive but were deliberate, near exits, near the front desk, near the hallway that led to the evidence room. Dorsey, the regular front desk officer, had come back from wherever Falco had displaced him and was standing near the wall with his arms crossed and an expression of someone who has been waiting for this and is relieved it finally arrived. Stroud was at his desk and had not moved. Falco was near the coffee station and was also not moving because there was a federal agent 4 feet away from him whose presence made movement feel like a decision requiring more confidence than Falco currently had. 3 other officers Maya didn't know well enough to have categorized were clustered near the briefing room entrance, watching the federal agents with the wary attention of people who are innocent of the specific thing being investigated and are deeply concerned about whether that will be legible. Torres was at her desk. She had her hands flat on the surface and her eyes forward, and she was very still in the particular way of someone who has done something that scared her and is now waiting to find out whether it was the right thing. Maya walked past her desk and didn't stop. Stopping would have been the wrong thing, would have drawn attention to Torres in a way that served neither of them. But as she passed, she angled slightly closer than the direct path required, close enough that Torres could see her without having to look up conspicuously. Torres's hand stayed flat on the desk. Greer was near the window at the far end of the room. I was looking outside at the parking lot where 2 federal vehicles were visible, and his profile from across the room was the profile of a man doing a kind of internal accounting that was going to take longer than the next few minutes to complete. Agent Voss stopped at the edge of the main floor and turned to Maya. We're going to need you when we go to Holloway's office. You've had the most direct contact. If he's going to talk to anyone in that building before his attorney arrives, it's not going to be me. He won't talk, Maya said. Not voluntarily. He's too experienced. Probably not. But I want him to see you standing there when that door opens. She understood. There was a difference between arresting someone who had never seen it coming and arresting someone who had to stand in front of the person who had documented everything, and that difference mattered, not legally, but in the particular psychology of accountability, of forcing a confrontation with the gap between who you believed you were and what you actually did. They walked to Holloway's office. Voss knocked twice, announced herself through the door. 30 seconds passed. The door opened. Holloway had aged in the last 40 minutes. Not literally, not in any way that was physically dramatic, but there was something about the set of his face that was different from everything she had cataloged across 31 days of watching him. The certainty was gone, not replaced by anything soft. Derek Holloway was not a man who did soft. But the bedrock of it, the thing that had made him walk into every room like the room already belonged to him, had shifted in some structural way that showed at the surface. He looked at Voss. He looked at the agent beside her. And then he looked at Maya, and for a moment he didn't look like a sergeant, or a 22-year veteran, or a man with 18 commendations and a feature in the county newspaper. He looked like someone standing in the specific geography of a consequence he had spent a long time believing he was exempt from. I have an attorney, he said. His voice was controlled. Not steady, controlled, which required more effort. You have the right to wait for your attorney, Voss said. We're not here to question you right now. We're here to inform you that you are under arrest pending federal charges, including evidence fabrication, civil rights violations, conspiracy to obstruct justice, an abuse of authority. She was reading it from nothing. She had it memorized, as people do when they've been preparing for a moment for a long time. You'll be transported to the Federal Processing Facility in Columbus. Your attorney can meet you there. He listened to it. His jaw was set, but he was listening, taking it in with the deliberate care of a man who knows that how he behaves in the next 30 seconds is going to be part of a record. His eyes came back to Maya. "How long?" he said. Not to Voss, to her. She understood the question. "The federal operation was opened 14 months ago," she said. "I've been here 31 days. He worked through the arithmetic of that. 14 months of investigation before she'd walked through his door. The preliminary work, the surveillance, the financial forensics, the whistleblower testimony, all of it accumulating before she'd ever filled out a locker assignment form or fumbled with a patrol car radio in front of Stroud. He had looked at her on day one and seen someone who didn't matter, and the operation had already been running for over a year before she arrived. "You were never a rookie," he said. "No," she said. "I wasn't." Something moved across his face, not admiration, not quite respect, but the unwilling acknowledgement that passes between people when one of them has fundamentally misread the other and is forced to revise. He looked at her for 2 more seconds. Then he looked away, and the look away had the quality of finality. They walked him out. The main floor went silent when Holloway came through it in handcuffs. Not the dramatic silence of a scene, the actual silence of 30 people watching something happen that they had not, on any operational level, prepared themselves for. Officers who had laughed at his jokes, who had angled their careers around his preferences, who had looked away from the things he did because looking away was easier than the alternative. They all stood in their various postures of stillness and watched the man who had functioned as the gravitational center of this institution for 2 decades walk through his own precinct in federal custody. Stroud stood up when Holloway passed his desk. Not to do anything, just stood, the reflex of a man whose organizing principle was being physically disassembled in front of him. Falco turned to look out the window. Greer watched from his spot near the far wall, and his face was doing several things at once that probably required more privacy to fully process than a crowded precinct floor could provide. Torres kept her hands flat on her desk. She watched Holloway pass. She didn't look at Maya. Vale was brought out 7 minutes later by 2 different agents. He had made a phone call during those 7 minutes, and the call had apparently not gone the way he wanted, because he came out of the conference room with the posture of a man who has assessed his position and found it significantly worse than he'd hoped. He walked through the main floor faster than Holloway had, looking at a point approximately 6 inches in front of his own feet, and he did not look up. Maya stood near the edge of the main floor and watched both men leave through the front doors. Through the precinct's front windows, she could see the federal vehicles in the parking lot, could see Holloway being placed in the rear of one of them, could see a small cluster of people on the sidewalk across the street, civilians who had seen the vehicles, who had stopped to watch the way people stop when they understand that something institutional is in the process of breaking open. She thought about the 6 arrests in Westgate. She thought about the adjusted patrol logs. She thought about Darnell Okafor's face, the stillness of it, the caught breath. And she thought about the 6 other people whose files were cross-referenced in the federal case, whose convictions were now subject to review, whose lives had been redirected by documentation that had been deliberately, carefully falsified by a man who had just been walked through his own precinct in handcuffs. She was not finished. There was still a significant amount of work ahead. The federal prosecution, the evidence hearings, the review of prior convictions, the departmental restructuring that would follow a civil rights investigation of this scale. None of that was clean or fast or simple. She knew that. She had never operated under the assumption that the arrest was the ending. But this part was done. Agent Voss appeared at her elbow. "We need to debrief you. Columbus this evening. The field office has a room set up." "I need an hour first," Maya said. Voss looked at her. "For what?" "There's an officer who took significant personal risks to provide evidence critical to this case. I'd like to speak with her before I leave this building." Voss studied her for a moment. Then, 1 hour. I'll have a car waiting." "What?" She found Torres in the break room, which was empty. Everyone else on the floor was either being formally interviewed by federal agents or managing the specific kind of institutional paralysis that sets in when an organization's leadership structure has just been removed by external authority. Torres was making coffee, which was what Torres did when she needed something to do with her hands. Maya sat down at the break room table. She didn't say anything immediately. Let Torres finish with the coffee, let her sit down across the table, let the moment settle before it needed to be anything. "It's over," Torres said. "Not a question. The arrests are made. The federal case is in prosecution now." Maya folded her hands on the table. "What you gave me, the 14 months of access logs, that's going to be significant. The forensic accountant has been working the financial thread, and your documentation closes a major gap." Torres looked at her coffee cup. "Are they going to know it came from me?" "Your name will be in the evidence disclosure during prosecution. I can't change that." She paused. "But I can tell you that the federal civil rights statute protects whistleblowers in law enforcement investigations. You're a protected source. Any retaliation, job action, harassment, informal pressure is a separate federal offense." "That sounds nice on paper." "It does," Maya agreed. "The reality is more complicated. People may treat you differently. The officers who were aligned with Holloway, they'll know eventually. Some of them won't forgive it." She looked at Torres directly. "I'm not going to tell you it's going to be easy. I don't know that." Torres looked up. "Then why are you telling me this stuff?" "Because you deserve to know what you actually did and what it actually cost you, instead of a version that's cleaner than it is." Maya let that sit for a second. "And because what you did mattered. Not in a small way. In a way that's going to affect 6 people's convictions being reviewed, and potentially more. You did that." Torres didn't respond to that directly. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at the table surface. After a moment, she said, "The Okafor kid, is he still in holding?" "The DA's office has been notified. His charges will be reviewed as part of the civil rights investigation. It won't be instant, but it's moving." "How old is he?" 22. Torres exhaled. It was a sound with a lot of things in it. Relief, probably, and something more complicated. The particular weight of having watched something happen to someone and not stopped it, and now being in the first minutes of understanding that you were part of stopping it after all. "I have a meeting in Columbus tonight," Maya said, "but I wanted you to know, before I leave this building, that your name is in my report specifically in the context of cooperation with a federal investigation. That's not nothing. Officially, it's on record that you did the right thing." Torres nodded, very small, looking at the cup. Maya stood up. "Take care of yourself. Get the union rep involved early. Don't wait. Document anything that feels like retaliation the moment it happens." "You sound like you're not coming back," Torres said. "I'm not coming back as who I was here." Maya looked at her for a moment. "But this department is going into federal oversight. There will be people in this building for a long time, making sure it becomes something different. The work isn't done. It's just changing shape." She left Torres in the break room and went to collect the few things that were actually hers from the locker on Cloverfield Street, and then she drove to the federal field office in Columbus. And the drive took 3 hours, and for most of it she didn't think about anything in particular. The landscape moved past the windows, the highway, the flat Ohio fields, the exits she'd passed in the other direction 6 weeks ago, when she'd been going toward a place she hadn't known well enough yet to dread or appreciate. She felt tired in a way that was straightforward and clean, the tiredness of having done a sustained and difficult thing and now being on the other side of it. She thought briefly about her mother's kitchen, the burnt coffee, the too loud radio. She thought about Darnell Okafor and hoped very specifically that whatever came next for him was something he'd actually chosen. She got to Columbus at 7:40, parked in the structure next to the federal building, and went inside. The debrief lasted 4 hours. It was conducted by Voss and a senior attorney from the Civil Rights Division named Okafor, not the same Okafor, just a coincidence that Maya clocked and filed away, and a forensic analyst who spent 40 minutes going through the encrypted documentation with her, cross-referencing her testimony against the transmitted files, flagging 3 items for clarification and confirming the rest. It was methodical and exhausting and necessary, and Maya answered every question with the same precision she'd applied to the original documentation, because accuracy in the debrief was as important as accuracy in the field. At 11:30, Voss poured 2 cups of coffee from a machine in the corner and set one in front of Maya without asking. They were alone in the room for the first time since the precinct. The financial forensics, Voss said. You want to know what we found? Yes. Holloway has been receiving payments from a contractor who supplies evidence materials to 3 county departments, including Millhaven. She said it flatly, the same way you'd describe a weather pattern. The contractor's records show irregular purchase orders going back 6 years, bulk purchases of packaging materials consistent with the type used in the planted evidence. Not conclusive alone, but combined with your access logs and the original evidence analysis on the Westgate arrests, it closes the loop. Maya thought about this. 6 years. She had spent 14 months inside a 14-month operation, and the things she'd been investigating had roots that went back 6 years before the federal case had even opened. 31 days inside the precinct, and the architecture she'd been mapping had been built over nearly a decade. The contractor, she said. Is there a connection to Vale? We think so. He's cooperating. Voss said it without inflection, which was the only way to say it. Cooperation from someone like Vale was a strategic decision, not a moral one, and treating it as the latter would be a mistake. He's giving us names in exchange for a sentencing consideration. The U.S. Attorney's Office is managing that. How many names? Enough. Voss looked at her. You did the hardest part, Maya. 31 days inside that building without breaking cover, without making a mistake that cost the case. That's the part nobody outside this room is going to fully understand. Maya looked at the coffee cup in front of her. She thought about saying something and then didn't because there wasn't anything to say that was more accurate than silence. What happens now? She said instead. Millhaven PD goes under a federal consent decree. They'll have a monitor for at least 3 years, mandated restructuring, independent oversight of all evidence handling. The prior convictions from the Westgate arrests go into a review process. The Innocence Project attorneys are already involved. Holloway's arraignment is Monday. Vale's is the same day. Voss set down her coffee. And you go on leave for 60 days, which is mandatory after an undercover operation of this duration. After that, we'll talk about what's next. The Okafor case, Maya said. Darnell Okafor. He's been in holding. I made a call on the way here. The assistant DA is reviewing his case as a priority. He should be out within 48 hours. Voss looked at her steadily. I'll make sure you know when it happens. Maya nodded. It was not the immediate resolution she wanted. 48 hours was not tonight. But it was real. And it was moving. And that was the best she could do from a conference room in Columbus at 11:30 on a day that had started with a review panel and ended with a federal debrief. She drove to a hotel 2 miles from the federal building and checked in with a credit card that was actually hers for the first time in 5 weeks. She took a shower. She ordered food that arrived lukewarm and ate most of it sitting on the edge of the bed. She picked up her phone, her personal phone, the one she hadn't touched since she'd entered the Millhaven operation, and looked at the screen for a long moment. There were messages. Not many, because the people in her life understood the nature of her work. But a few, her mother, 2 colleagues from the federal program, a friend from law school who checked in periodically with messages that asked nothing specific and expected nothing prompt. She typed back to her mother, I'm okay. Job's done. Call you tomorrow. She put the phone down, lay back on the hotel bed, let the silence of an ordinary hotel room with its ordinary carpet and its slightly too hard pillows and the ambient noise of an air conditioning unit doing its job settle around her. She was not at peace exactly. She was not uncomplicated. The people who needed accountability had it beginning, which was not the same as having it complete. And the people who had been harmed by the things she'd spent 14 months investigating were going to be living with that harm long after the federal case was closed and the consent decree was signed, and her name had faded from whatever paperwork this eventually became. But Darnell Okafor was going home in 48 hours. And 6 other names in the Westgate files were moving toward a review process that hadn't existed yesterday. And a precinct that had been operating as a contained, self-protecting system of institutional harm was now under federal oversight that would last for years. She stared at the ceiling of the hotel room and thought about Torres's hands flat on her desk, and Greer in the parking lot with his hands in his pockets, and the particular weight of people who do something brave in a building where bravery is expensive and then have to go back and live with the cost of it. She thought the work she could do from a hotel room at midnight was 0. She thought, sleep. She was almost there when her phone lit up. Not a call. A text from a number she didn't have saved with a 614 area code. Columbus. 3 words. Check the warrant. She sat up. She stared at the screen. The number was unfamiliar. The message had no context. And the timing, midnight, the night of the arrests, hours after the debrief, was too precise to be accidental. She opened her laptop, pulled up the federal case portal she had access to through her agent credentials, found the search warrant for the raid on the Millhaven precinct, which had been executed that afternoon, which she had seen the paperwork for during the debrief. She read through it, found nothing she didn't already know. Read through it again, more slowly, looking for whatever the text was pointing at. Then she found it. In the affidavit supporting the warrant, the document that laid out the probable cause for federal action, there was a summary of the evidence collected during the undercover operation. Her evidence: 31 days of documentation. It was described accurately, attributed correctly to a federal undercover agent operating under the designation UV7, which was the operational code for her assignment, UV7, her. But there was a second designation listed, a reference to information received from a separate federal source within the Millhaven PD that had independently corroborated elements of the UV7 investigation. UV12. A second undercover agent. She had not known about UV12. The operation briefing she'd been given had described a single agent insertion. The federal program handler she'd called from the payphone had given her no indication that there was anyone else inside that building. For 31 days, she had operated as if she was the only federal presence in the Millhaven PD. She hadn't been. Someone else had been in that precinct the entire time. Someone who had corroborated her evidence independently, which meant they had access she didn't, could see things she couldn't, and had been watching the same institution from an angle she hadn't been given. She sat on the edge of the hotel bed at 12:17 a.m. and thought about the anonymous email. Someone inside the precinct knows you're not who you say you are. Not a threat. A warning. From someone who knew about the compromise because they were operating in the same space and had caught the same signal she had, and had decided that warning her was the priority. She thought about the 30 people in that precinct. She ran through them: Stroud, Falco, Greer, Torres, Ruiz, Dorsey, Rice, Paulson, the officers she'd cataloged and the ones she'd only partly mapped. She thought about who had access to what, who had moved through the precinct in ways she hadn't fully tracked, who might have been there for a reason she hadn't accounted for. UV12 was still unidentified, and the text that had just woken her up had come from a Columbus area code, which could mean the federal office, or it could mean someone who was also, right now, sitting in a hotel room somewhere in Columbus, looking at the same warrant, waiting to see whether she'd found it yet. Her phone lit up again. Same number. One word this time. Tomorrow. She looked at the word on the screen for a long time. Then she set the phone face down on the nightstand, lay back, and stared at the ceiling with the particular alertness of someone who has finished one thing and is beginning to understand that the shape of what comes next is going to be different from anything she planned for. She slept 3 hours and woke before the alarm she hadn't set. The hotel room was gray with early morning light coming through curtains that didn't quite meet in the middle, and she lay still for a moment listening to the air conditioning and thinking about UV12. She had run through the possibilities twice more before sleep had finally taken her, and she'd arrived at no conclusions. Only the recognition that the second undercover agent was someone she'd shared a building with for 31 days without identifying, which was either a testament to their training or to some blind spot in her own observation that she was going to have to examine at some point. She got up, showered again, dressed, made the coffee that came in the small machine on the hotel dresser, and drank it standing at the window, looking out at a Columbus parking structure in the early morning. And she thought about what tomorrow meant when you received it as a single word at 12:17 a.m. Her phone showed nothing new from the 614 number. She checked the federal case portal. Holloway and Vale had both been formally processed overnight, arraignment confirmed for Monday, attorneys of record listed. The warrant was still there in the system, and UV12 was still there in the warrant, unelaborated, a designation without a name attached to anything she could access at her clearance level. At 7:15, she drove to the federal field office. She was 40 minutes early, and she sat in the parking structure for 30 of them, because being early to a meeting you've been mysteriously summoned to by a text message from an unidentified second undercover agent was not a posture she wanted to walk in with. She went inside at 7:46. The agent at the front desk told her Agent Voss was expecting her on the fourth floor, and she rode the elevator up and walked down a corridor that smelled like institutional carpet and recycled air, and found the conference room where Voss was already seated with 2 cups of coffee on the table and someone else across from her who had their back to the door. The person turned around when Maya came in. It was Greer. He looked different outside the precinct, not dramatically, not in the way of someone who has been transformed, but in the small ways of a person who is no longer performing a version of themselves designed to pass unnoticed in a specific environment. His hands were on the table, not in his pockets. He was sitting straight. He looked tired in a way that was also something else, relieved maybe, or at least close enough to it that the difference wasn't worth measuring right now. Maya sat down. She looked at him. She looked at Voss. Officer Dennis Greer, Voss said, has been operating as UV-12 for 8 months. The room was quiet for a moment. Maya looked back at Greer. The parking lot, she said. Not a question. She was recalibrating, running the conversation back through a different lens. I saw that play out before. Different name, different street. He hadn't been a witness building courage. He'd been a colleague giving her confirmation she was on the right track without breaking his own cover. I couldn't tell you, he said. Compartmentalization. Voss's call, not mine. I know. She looked at the coffee cup in front of her. The email. Check the warrant. Yeah, I figured you'd find it, but I wanted to make sure. You'd transmitted everything, and I thought, if you didn't know about the financial threat I had, you might not know the warrant referenced a second source. He shifted. I wanted you to know it wasn't just you, that someone else in that building saw the same things. She thought about 31 days of being the only person in a room who knew what was actually happening, thought about the particular kind of alone that is, and how the knowledge that it hadn't been entirely true was doing something unexpected in her chest. Not resentment at not knowing, but something closer to retroactive relief, like finding out a bridge you'd crossed alone had actually had a second support structure you couldn't see from the top. The mortgage, she said. The kid. Both real, he said. It's not... I wasn't performing the fear, okay? It's genuinely complicated when you have a family. I made different choices than you did, about what to show and what to hide. That's not an excuse. I didn't say it was. Voss had been watching the exchange with the stillness of someone who has set something in motion and is waiting to see where it goes. Greer's 8 months inside the department gave us the financial thread. The contractor relationship, the payment structure, that came from physical evidence he accessed. Your 31 days gave us the behavioral pattern, the incident documentation, the witness-level testimony. She folded her hands on the table. Separately, each case is solid. Together, it's airtight. Maya looked at Greer. You wrote the anonymous note. They're moving the evidence. Paper note on your keyboard. Yeah. He almost smiled. Not quite. I couldn't put my name on it, but I needed you to move faster on the transmission. She thought about the night she'd sat in her car on Cloverfield Street after finding that note, running contingencies, deciding the timeline had to compress. She had believed it was a sympathetic officer, possibly Torres, possibly someone she hadn't identified. She had made decisions based on it that had accelerated her documentation and ultimately moved the transmission to that morning. The note had mattered. It worked, she said. Yeah, he said. I know. They looked at each other across the table. Two people who had spent 8 months and 31 days, respectively, inside an institution doing careful, invisible, costly work, and who had, for most of that time, been doing it in the same building without being able to acknowledge each other's existence. It was a strange thing to sit with. Not comfortable, not cleanly resolved, but human in the specific way of things that are complicated precisely because they involve people making hard choices under hard constraints. What happens to you now? She asked. Administrative leave while they sort the departmental restructuring. Then, he shook his head slightly. I don't know. My wife wants to move, which I understand. The people in that building who figure out what I did, some of them are going to take it personally. Torres helped us, Maya said. She took a real risk. I know. I saw her give you that printout. He paused. She's braver than she thinks she is. Most people are, when it actually comes to it. Voss set down her coffee cup. There's something else, she said, and the shift in her tone was the kind that preceded information rather than logistics. Holloway's attorney filed a motion this morning to suppress the undercover recordings on the basis of unauthorized surveillance. She looked at Maya. It won't succeed. The federal authorization is clean, but I want you to understand that this is going to be a long prosecution, 18 months minimum before trial, possibly longer. I know how federal cases work, Maya said. I know you do. I'm saying it because you should hear it out loud before you go on leave and try to decompress. So you're not expecting a clean ending in 60 days. Voss was direct in the way that good supervisors are direct, not unkind, not softening the facts, but also not delivering them as if the difficulty was the point. What you built holds. The case is solid, but solid cases still take time. And Darnell Okafor? Voss's expression shifted slightly. Out of holding as of 7 this morning. Charges formally suspended pending the civil rights review. His attorney was there when they processed him out. Maya let out a breath. She hadn't realized she was holding it. 7 this morning, she said. You were in the parking structure, Voss said, with the dry precision of someone who'd tracked her badge scan time. You wanted to be early. She drove back to Millhaven that afternoon. She hadn't planned to. The 60 days of mandatory leave meant she had no operational reason to be there, and the apartment on Cloverfield Street was going to be handed back to the federal program within the week. But she wanted to go back once. Not for any reason she could have fully articulated, but in the way that you sometimes need to see a place after the thing that happened in it has concluded, to give your memory a complete image rather than the frozen one of the last pressurized moment. The precinct was visibly different from the outside, which she hadn't expected. 2 federal vehicles in the parking lot. A notice posted on the front door. She couldn't read it from the street, but the white paper rectangle of it was visible, official-looking. The physical evidence of federal oversight made legible. The parking lot had fewer personal vehicles than usual, which meant reduced staffing, which made sense given that the department was in administrative limbo pending the consent decree negotiations. She didn't go inside. She drove slowly past and kept going. She went to Cloverfield Street, packed the few things that were actually hers. It didn't take long. She'd arrived with almost nothing, and left the key on the kitchen counter. She stood in the empty apartment for a moment before she left. The carpet smell, the cooking sounds from upstairs, the particular acoustic quality of a place where she'd spent 31 nights being someone else. She looked at the room without feeling much about it specifically, which was itself a kind of information. She had not become attached to this place, which was the correct outcome. But she noted that the absence of attachment was not the same as the absence of weight. She walked out. Drove south on Route 9 toward Columbus, because her personal car was in a federal facility there, and she needed to collect it before the leave started. Her phone rang on the highway. The area code was Millhaven. She almost didn't answer. Then she did. "This is Torres," said the voice on the other end. "I know," Maya said. A pause. "I wanted to tell you something before I talked myself out of it. When you were here and I saw what you were doing, the report you wrote about Okafor, the way you just kept coming in every day, I thought for a long time that you were just naive, that you didn't understand how things worked here." Maya said nothing. Let her continue. "And then I thought, she knows exactly how things work here, and she's doing it anyway. And I didn't know what to do with that." Another pause, and in the pause was the specific texture of a person organizing a thought they've been carrying for a while. "I just wanted to say that watching you do that, it changed something for me about what I thought was possible for myself in this job. So, thank you," Maya said. "Yeah." Torres sounded slightly embarrassed by her own sincerity, which was a human response to having said something true and unguarded. "That's all." "It wasn't nothing what you did," Maya said. "I want you to remember that when it gets hard. And it will get hard. But it wasn't nothing." The call ended. Maya drove south with the Ohio landscape on both sides of the highway and the particular feeling of a thread being completed, not the story, which was still ongoing, still in courts and review boards and consent decree negotiations, but the part of it that was hers to carry directly. The federal building in Columbus had a small conference room on the second floor that Voss had reserved for the formal commendation briefing, which was not a ceremony so much as a meeting with paperwork. The Associate Deputy Director of the FBI's Civil Rights Division had come down from Washington for it, which was unusual enough that the other agents in the building had apparently noticed. There was a specific quality to the hallways on the second floor when Maya arrived, a slightly elevated level of ambient awareness. People finding reasons to be near the corridor outside the conference room. She had changed into clothes that were actually hers, not the rookie officer's uniform, not the apartment-dwelling civilian's practical choices, but the kind of clothes that reflected an accurate version of herself. It was a small thing. She noticed it. The associate deputy director was a woman in her late 50s named Harlow, compact and precise, with the deliberate manner of someone who has learned that efficiency and warmth are not mutually exclusive and operates accordingly. She shook Maya's hand when she came in, looked at her directly, said, "Sit down. This won't take long, but it matters that we do it properly." There was paperwork. There is always paperwork. The formal commendation, the notation in her personnel file, the documentation of the operation's outcome to date, 2 federal arrests, 14 months of financial evidence corroborating the civil rights violations, 6 prior convictions entering review, a police department placed under consent decree, 1 pending prosecution that would establish precedent in federal civil rights enforcement in Ohio. Harlow read through the highlights with the same tone she'd use for any briefing, and then she set the papers down and looked at Maya and said, "You were in that building for 31 days with a compromised cover, no direct communication with your handler, and 6 hours notice of an accelerated hearing. You transmitted complete evidentiary documentation and maintained your cover through an illegal arrest attempt, a planted weapon, an intimidation hearing, and a federal entry. You didn't break. The case didn't break." She said it plainly, without the rhetoric that commendation sometimes accumulated. It landed the way plain things land, harder than ornate things, because there's nothing for the impact to deflect off of. "Thank you," Maya said. "I also want to say something that's not in the paperwork." Harlow folded her hands on the table. "I read your operation reports, not the summaries, the actual daily logs. The detail in them, the precision, the way you tracked behavioral patterns, and cross-referenced them against documentary evidence. You were doing the work of 3 people and doing it alone." She paused. "That takes a particular kind of person, not fearless. Fear is actually useful in the field. I mean someone who can be afraid and precise at the same time, which is considerably rarer." Maya thought about the hotel bathroom, the cold water on her wrists, the way she'd sat in the parking lot on Cloverfield Street after the interrogation and given herself 3 minutes to feel the weight of it before starting the car. "I was afraid a lot," she said. "I know. It's in the reports." Harlow almost smiled. "That's why I said it." The paperwork was signed. The meeting concluded. Voss walked her out and in the hallway handed her a folder. Physical, paper, thin. "Your next assignment," Voss said. "When leave is over, read it at home. You have 60 days. Maya looked at the folder without opening it. "Can you tell me what it is?" "No, but I can tell you it's not another single-agent insertion into a hostile institution." Voss looked at her steadily. "It's something you build from the outside. A task force. You'd be leading it." She held the folder, looked at it. "You don't have to take it," Voss said. "The leave gives you time to decide." "I'll take it," Maya said. "You haven't read it." "I know." She put the folder under her arm. "I'll read it. I'll still take it." Voss looked at her for a moment, with the expression of someone who has worked with enough people to know the difference between impulsiveness and clarity, and has just recognized the latter. She nodded once. 60 days, she said. Rest. She met Darnell Okafor 9 days later at a coffee shop in the neighborhood where he lived. Not Mill Haven, a different town, the one his family was from. He'd asked to meet through his attorney, who had passed the request to the federal case coordinator, who had passed it to Voss, who had asked Maya if she was willing. She'd said yes without needing to think about it. He was already there when she arrived, sitting at a corner table with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, wearing the same kind of college sweatshirt he'd been wearing the day Holloway had pulled him over on Fenwick Boulevard. He looked up when she came in, and she saw him process her out of uniform. She was in her own clothes, just a person walking into a coffee shop. And there was a moment of recalibration on his face before recognition settled. She sat down across from him. A server came and she ordered coffee she didn't particularly need, because it gave them both something to do while the weight of why they were here settled into a shape that was manageable. "I didn't know you were federal," he said. I thought I mean, you were just standing there while he put me on the sidewalk. I know. I'm not angry about it. He said it like he'd practiced saying it, because he probably had, and then he decided something and said the real thing underneath it. I was angry about it for a few days. I kept thinking she was right there. She could have just said something, stopped it. I know that too, Maya said, but my attorney explained why you couldn't, the case. He looked at his mug. If you'd blown the case that day to stop one arrest, Holloway would still be in that precinct, still be doing this to people. He looked up. Right? That's what I believed, she said. I still believe it. But that doesn't mean it wasn't a hard call or that you didn't spend weeks in holding because of it. He was quiet for a moment. 41 days, he said. She absorbed that. I know. I was supposed to start an internship, aerospace engineering program. I'd been trying to get that internship for 2 years. He wasn't saying it to make her feel worse. He was saying it because it was true and he needed it said. They deferred it. I'll be able to start next semester, but 41 days is still 41 days. Yes, she said. It is. Look, I'm not here to make you feel guilty or whatever. He exhaled. I'm here because I wanted to meet the person who wrote that report, that first report, the one that went in the official record. My attorney said that report is what made everything else possible. The report was what I observed, she said. That's all it was. No. He shook his head. I've read enough now to know that's not all it was. You were in a building full of people who were going to look the other way. You had every reason to look the other way too, and you didn't. He looked at her directly, with the steadiness of a 22-year-old who has had 41 days in a holding cell to think about what he believes and has arrived at conclusions that are going to stay with him. I wanted to say thank you, in person, because my attorney can communicate whatever, but I wanted you to know that I know what you did. She looked at him across the table. This young man in his college sweatshirt, who had been standing in front of a dry cleaner's carrying a backpack and minding his own business, and whose life had been interrupted and then, incrementally and imperfectly, and through a process that took far too long, been returned to him. The internship, she said. Aerospace engineering. He almost smiled. Yeah. You should go do that, she said. This time he did smile, brief, genuine, the smile of someone who is going to be okay, not because things are easy or because the memory of the last several months is going to simply evaporate, but because he has decided to be. Yeah, he said. I'm going to. They talked for another 20 minutes about nothing particularly consequential. His family, the neighborhood, the deferred internship, and what it would involve. Small talk, but the kind that had weight in it, because small talk between people who have been through something together carries the texture of the thing even when it's about something else entirely. When she left, she stood on the sidewalk outside the coffee shop for a moment in the October air, which had the particular quality of Ohio autumn, sharp, slightly damp, smelling of leaves and distance, and she felt something that she didn't have a single word for. It was a combination of things, the weight of what had happened and the satisfaction of a specific outcome achieved, and the clear-eyed acknowledgement that the satisfaction was partial, because 41 days was still 41 days, and the 6 people whose convictions were under review were still in the middle of a process that hadn't concluded, and the Millhaven PD was under federal oversight that would require years of sustained effort from people who would need to do their work in an institution that was going to resist changing in the way institutions always resist changing. Nothing was clean. Nothing was complete. That was not a failure. It was an accurate description of how accountability actually works in the world, which is slowly, incompletely, under pressure, with people bearing costs they shouldn't have to bear, and making decisions that cost them things they shouldn't have to lose. She walked to her car, got in, drove. Holloway's trial began 18 months later, which was 2 months longer than the federal prosecutor had initially projected and 5 months shorter than Holloway's defense team had hoped for through procedural delays. By the time the trial opened, it had accumulated the kind of public attention that federal civil rights prosecutions rarely get, not because the media had decided it was interesting, but because the Westgate families had organized, and 3 of the 6 people whose convictions were under review had spoken publicly, and the combination of their testimony and the federal documentation had made the scale of what had happened in Millhaven impossible to reduce to an institutional footnote. Maya testified on the 4th day. She had testified in federal proceedings before. It was part of the job, and she had been trained in it, and she knew the mechanics of a courtroom from a witness perspective. But testifying about your own undercover operation, about 31 days of work that you had done alone in a hostile environment, in front of a gallery that included the families of people who had been harmed and journalists, and the 6 Westgate defendants whose review cases were still ongoing, that was different. Not because it was harder than the field work, but because in the field you are not visible. In the field, invisibility is the tool. On a witness stand, you are everything you actually are, with no cover and no performance. The defense attorney was competent in trying to establish that the federal investigation had been improperly conducted, that the evidence had been collected outside legal parameters, that the undercover insertion had violated departmental notification protocols. She knew these arguments were going to fail. The legal authorization was clean. Voss had made sure of that before the operation was a day old. But she also knew that the defense attorney had to make them, because his job was to make them, and she respected the obligation even while she was going to dismantle it. She answered every question with the same precision she'd applied to the documentation. She didn't embellish. She didn't editorialize. She described what she had seen and heard and recorded, in what order, under what circumstances, with what results. When the defense attorney suggested that her incident report about the Okafor stop had been a federal plant rather than an honest account, she looked at him calmly and said, "I wrote what I observed. You have the recording of the stop on which my report was based. The recording and the report match because I wrote what happened." He moved on. When the federal prosecutor asked her, on redirect, whether she had been afraid during the 31 days of the operation, she considered the question for a moment before answering. "Yes," she said, "regularly." "Did that affect your work?" "It informed my work," she said. "There's a difference. Fear is information. It told me when I needed to be more careful, when the situation was escalating, when someone in the room had changed their assessment of me, and that change was a risk. I used it." She paused. "I didn't let it make my decisions." The gallery was quiet. "Thank you," the prosecutor said. She stepped down from the stand and walked back through the gallery. She didn't look at Holloway, who was seated at the defense table, and who she had not looked at directly since the hearing room when she'd told him he should have checked who she really was. She didn't look at Vale, who was in a separate trial that had already concluded with a guilty plea and a sentencing hearing pending. She walked out of the courtroom and stood in the hallway and breathed the filtered air of a federal courthouse, which had the same quality as the air inside the Millhaven interrogation room and the federal building in Columbus and every institutional space she'd ever occupied. Recycled, slightly too cool, the smell of nothing in particular. And she thought about the fact that she had been standing in spaces like this for most of her adult life, doing work that the people in those spaces would never know was happening, and that this was a choice she had made deliberately and kept making, and she was still making it. The jury found Holloway guilty on 11 of 14 counts. The 4 counts that didn't result in guilty verdicts were procedural. Evidence handling charges where the chain of custody had a technical gap, the defense had successfully argued. But the remaining 11 included the civil rights violations, the evidence fabrication, the conspiracy, and the abuse of authority that had been at the center of the federal case from the beginning. The sentencing was set for 3 months out. She got a text from Greer that evening. 11 counts, that's the job. She texted back, "That's the job." He sent back nothing else, which was correct. Torres called. She didn't answer immediately. She was in the car, driving, and she let it go to voicemail and listened to it at a red light. Torres's voice was quieter than usual and very direct. "I watched the whole thing on the court feed. What you said up there, about fear. I've been thinking about that ever since you left, about the difference between fear making your decisions and fear informing them." A pause. "I think I've been letting mine make them for a long time. Anyway, I'm working on it." The message ended. Maya put the phone back in the cup holder and drove. She thought about Torres's hands flat on the desk. She thought about Greer in the parking lot with his hands in his pockets. She thought about the people who had done the visible, costly things in that precinct and the people who hadn't. And she did not judge the ones who hadn't as harshly as she might have before 31 days inside an institution that pressurized everyone inside it toward the same gravity, because she understood now, more concretely than before, what it costs to stand against something that has been standing a long time. The task force that Voss had handed her in a thin folder took 2 years to build and involved 6 federal agencies, 4 state civil rights offices, and a methodology for investigating systemic evidence tampering in municipal law enforcement that she had spent 9 months designing. She wasn't in the field for most of it. She was in conference rooms and over secure video calls and writing documents that would become protocols, frameworks, training materials, the foundational architecture of how a team of investigators would work together to identify and document the kind of institutional corruption that is hardest to see because it has been normalized so thoroughly that the institution itself no longer recognizes it as deviation. It was different from undercover work. It was slower, more collaborative, less immediately concrete, and in some ways harder because the results were diffuse and long-term rather than documented and transmitted. She made mistakes in it, misjudged a timeline once that cost them 3 months, underestimated the resistance from a state attorney's office that needed a different approach than she'd planned for, pushed a junior investigator too hard in a way she recognized 3 weeks too late and had to acknowledge directly. She was not a perfect leader. She hadn't expected to be because she'd never been a perfect anything, and the expectation would have been a liability rather than an asset. What she was, slowly and imperfectly, and through sustained effort, was an effective one. The task force opened its first full investigation in its 2nd year. By the 3rd year, it had resulted in 4 departmental consent decrees, 2 federal prosecutions, and the review of over 40 prior convictions in 3 states. She went home to see her mother on a Tuesday in November, 2.5 years after Millhaven, and sat at the kitchen table while her mother made cornbread she didn't need and the radio played at its characteristic volume. Her mother set the coffee down in front of her and looked at her with the specific appraisal of a woman who has been watching her daughter navigate a hard world for her entire life and has her own precise accounting of the costs. "You look tired," her mother said. "I'm okay." "I didn't say you weren't okay. I said you look tired." Maya wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. Outside the kitchen window, the late November light was going early, the way it does, the day compressing toward dark before you're ready for it. "The Holloway sentencing was last week," she said. "I know, I read it." 14 years. Her mother sat down across from her. She had the same quality of stillness that Maya had inherited and never quite recognized as an inheritance until she was old enough to see where it came from. "Is that what you thought it would be?" Maya thought about it. "I thought it would feel more finished than it does," she said. "The 6 Westgate cases are all resolved now. Okafor's doing his internship. The department's under oversight. Holloway's going to prison. And it still feels like—" She stopped. "Like the thing that made it possible for it to happen in the first place is still out there. In other places. Other departments." "Of course it is," her mother said simply. "Yeah. And you're building the thing that goes after it." She looked at her mother, at the face that had been the last thing she'd thought about on the drive into Millhaven, before a building she didn't know yet, at the beginning of something she'd only seen in briefing documents and preliminary reports. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone, baby," meaning the opposite. "I'm trying to," Maya said. "Then that's what you're doing," her mother said, and got up to check the oven, because that was how her mother handled large things, by stating them plainly and moving on to the next concrete task, which was its own form of wisdom. Maya sat at the kitchen table with the coffee and the too loud radio and the smell of cornbread and thought about the things she had learned in the past 3 years that she couldn't have articulated before she'd lived them. That power protects itself with the people inside it, and that the most effective way to understand how power works is to spend time being the person it doesn't believe is a threat. That fear doesn't disqualify you. It equips you, if you know how to read it. That the people who do the small, costly, undramatic acts of integrity in hostile environments, the Torres moment in a hallway, the Greer conversation in a parking lot, the report that goes in the official record when every other force in the room is pushing against it, those acts matter even when they don't immediately look like they matter, because they become part of what the accountability is built on later. That being underestimated is painful and limiting and wrong, and that it can also be, under very specific circumstances and with very specific preparation, exactly the thing you need. She had walked into Millhaven as a person no one thought was worth watching. She had walked out as the person who had watched all of them. The gap between those two things was not a triumph exactly. It was messier than that, and more costly, and more impermanent, because the next building was going to have the same dynamics and require the same sustained attention and the same willingness to carry the weight of it for longer than any single person should have to carry it. But that was the work. That had always been the work. Not the arrest, not the verdict, not the moment when the handcuffs went on someone else, and the thing you built in the dark finally became visible in the light. Those were outcomes. The work was every day before them. The accuracy, the patience, the choosing again and again to write what was true rather than what was convenient, to be present in the room even when the room wanted you to disappear. She drank the coffee. She listened to the radio. She thought about the task force, about the 3 ongoing investigations, about the junior investigator she owed an honest conversation to when she got back on Monday. She thought about Darnell Okafor in an aerospace engineering internship, and Greer's kid in 3rd grade, and Torres working on something she'd been afraid of for a long time. She thought, the people who tried to silence you are never actually silencing you. They're just making you quieter than they realize you're capable of being, until the moment when quiet has done everything it needed to do, and you don't need it anymore. Her mother came back to the table and sat down and looked at her daughter with the plain, clear-eyed love of a woman who raised someone to do hard things and has accepted the terms of that, and said, "Eat something." Maya looked at her. Something in her chest loosened. Not broke, not flooded, just loosened the way a held breath releases when you finally arrived somewhere you didn't know you were trying to get to. "Yeah," she said. "Okay." She yit.